So, good afternoon, everybody. It's been wonderful to see so many of you on our previous virtual meeting revolution webinars, and it's great to see so many of you also with us today here on Zoom, also live on YouTube, and hello if you're watching on the YouTube replay afterwards. So, today's fifth virtual meeting revolution webinar is really focused on virtual facilitation. What does it take to make the meeting succeed? In the terms of the leading, the animating, the facilitating, the hosting, call it what you will. I like to use the word conducting actually, because you see here on the screen, you see the orchestra conductor. The orchestra conductor doesn't make much of a noise. It's the musicians who make the noise. But if there is no orchestra conductor, then there tends to be just an awful lot of noise and not some beautiful music. And that happens in a lot of online meetings where we hear a cacophony of lots of people talking at the same time, or people who aren't talking but have background noise. And in fact, we just heard in the news there was a Welsh minister who got in some trouble because he didn't have his microphone on mute on a Zoom meeting, and he used some particularly bad language, which he didn't really want to be going out to the public. So it's always important to make sure that you are managing these meetings in such a way that everybody is on mute when they're not speaking. And that's exactly what we do in these webinars, because everybody apart from me is on mute to make sure that we preserve the sound quality for everybody. So for those of you who are used to these webinars, you'll be used to this already, just as you'll be used to the sound of my voice, even though my colleagues Michael and Pierre have given webinars as well. But you'll also be used to the fact that you can use the chat function to interact with us, to talk to us, to ask us questions, to give comments, to give your feedback and your stories and your advice, because you've done a lot of these online meetings as well. And if you have horror stories or success stories, we'd actually be really happy to hear them, and they could be very useful for everybody. So please do use the chat to get in touch with us, to ask us about these things and to give your points of view. And Camille, my colleague, is online with us, so she is in charge of the chat. She will be animating that. She is, in fact, the facilitator of the meeting today. And that's a really important thing we need to bear in mind, and I will come back to that, because the facilitator and the key speaker ideally should be two very different people. Let me give you a little bit of context in terms of this particular webinar and how it comes into the series, just in case this is the first one of them that you've seen. So we've gone through several of the 5 steps to the virtual meeting success, which make up our virtual meeting revolution method, starting off with the foundation. Because if you build a building on a poor foundation, it's likely to fall away. You need a strong foundation, and that way your building will stand up. Your foundation for any kind of meeting is to really understand the context and to choose the objectives and the participants in coherence with each other and with the context. That's what we call making a good COP, right? Context, objective, participants. Once you've understood that, then you can move into the ideation phase and think, what kind of meeting might we want to have? What is the best way to achieve these objectives? And what are the ingredients we might use in the meeting to achieve those objectives? Some interaction, maybe a presentation, maybe a discussion here or there, maybe asking each person to go around the virtual table and tell us how they're feeling or what they've done this week or whatever it might be. Those are the things which we imagine while we're preparing this meeting. Once we've then got all of those ingredients, we go into the creation phase and we actually place all of those in a suitable order so that we have an agenda for our meeting. Then we move into illustration, where we prepare the documents and the slides which are necessary to succeed in the meeting. Note that I make the distinction between documents and slides, and we will come back to that. And finally, we then are going to get into the last piece, which is the connection phase, and that is where you are delivering your meeting, you're running the meeting, and aiming to achieve your objectives. So there's a lot of work up front, a lot of preparation work before you even get into the meeting to make sure it actually will succeed. Now, each of these is linked to a revolution. So we have these 5 virtual meeting revolutions. The first one, matched with the foundation phases, you always match the people with the purpose. The second, don't pollute meetings with unnecessary presentations if you can help it. Today, it's a webinar kind of meeting, so a presentation is important. But if you're having a team meeting or a collaboration meeting or a discussion meeting, only use presentations when there isn't a better way to achieve your objective. And always use documents, that's number 4, for information. During the meeting, number 3, you have to aim for attention and interaction, because if people aren't paying attention, then you're not going to get them to do what you need them to do in order to achieve your meeting objectives. If people are just sitting there reading the newspaper or checking their Facebook, you're not going to be succeeding. So you need to aim for attention. And the slides can help you to get people's attention and direct people's attention, as we saw in our third webinar. And then when it comes to the 5th revolution, and that's where we're going to be focusing today in the connection phase, we really do need to make sure that we are facilitating these meetings and doing it actively and doing it before, during, and after. That's what I'll be focusing on today. Now, in our previous webinars, the first one covered really the overview and then the foundation and the ideation phases and a bit of the creation. The second one focused on speaking. So that's really in the connection phase, but it's how to speak in an online meeting to grab and to keep people's attention and avoid that boring, monotonous voice and not looking at people or being way underneath the camera or way over the top so that people actually can't see all of your head. All of that is very important. In the third one, we covered the slides, the illustration, what you need to do in terms of using slides effectively online, which is not quite the same as it is in a real physical meeting room. Last week in our 4th webinar, Pierre covered something which is a much more basic topic, which is all about the setup that you need at home in order to succeed in these virtual meetings. So that setup underlies everything that we're doing here. And then this one is where we're not going to cover speaking. We're going to assume that you followed that one, but we're going to cover what is the responsibility of the facilitator before, during, and after the meeting. So that is where we're going to move and really focus into this, this connection phase. But the connection phase is the during of the meeting. It is important to bear in mind all of the other stuff, and that's why I've reminded you of this, because a lot of the responsibility of the facilitator actually happens before the meeting starts. It's all in this planning phase and also in the illustration. So let's really dive into this one and let's remind ourselves of the importance of that revolution. Facilitating meetings is important. Far too many meetings do not have a facilitator. Physical meetings don't, but also online meetings don't, and they should. What we're finding as we're working, as we're actually selling more and more webinars to clients, what we're realizing is that where you can deliver a training course, I can deliver a one-day training course and I'm the only trainer and I can do that on my own for 8, 10, 12 participants, etc. It's not a problem. I don't need anybody to hold my hand and help me in delivering that training. In an online webinar, I actually do need help. I actually do need somebody else because I'm sharing my screen here, so I'm not seeing you. I'm not able to see all of the chat. I'm not able to handle everyone, make sure that people are on mute when they shouldn't, when they should be, but they're not. So having somebody else, in this case today, having Camille to help me is a real relief because it allows me to be focusing on the training, on the delivery, on the speaking. So in any kind of online meeting, you actually really do need that facilitation role. It really is quite separate from the role of the key speaker or presenter, if there is one. So I really do like to think of those people as the conductor. So Camille today is the orchestra conductor. You might not hear her much until we get towards the end and she's relaying all of your questions to me, but her role is really important. So her role has been to make sure the meeting is set up. All of the emails that you've got, all of you've all signed up. Those of you who are here on Zoom, you signed up on Eventbrite. Well, that's Camille who's been handling all of that, who's been making sure that the invitations are there, the reminders are there, etc. All of this is really important. You can't underestimate the importance of that. So make the difference between the conductor and the musicians. So today I'm a musician. I'm not a very good musician, and trust me, I'm not going to try singing, right? But it's very important to recognize the role of that conductor. So have a think when if you're a manager, if you're organizing a meeting, who should the facilitator be? Who should that conductor be? Should it be you? If you're the team manager or the department head, you might not be the best person to be the conductor. You might find that you have an assistant. You might find that there is a right-hand person who is best placed to be doing that for you. And if you're the lead presenter, try and get somebody else to be doing that role for you, and it really does help. So let's have a look at the role of this conductor. So before, there are 4 key things which I'd like to focus on. Firstly, the technical setup. Secondly, attendance, and then the pre-read and the slides. So let's have a look at them one at a time. So when it comes to the technical setup, here it's important to choose which platform you're going to use. Are you going to use Zoom? Are you going to use Microsoft Teams or Google Hangout or whatever, or Google Meet, whatever it might be? There are plenty of different solutions nowadays, and there are new ones all the time. Choose which one you want. Choose which one you're going to use, which will work best for everybody. Make sure that the meeting is configured appropriately. Do you need a waiting room or not? Is that appropriate? Should participants be muted upon entry or not? All of these things are the responsibility of the facilitator. And there are so many options, so many possibilities just in Zoom, which is what I'm using all the time. There are so many different options and possibilities that it really is important to master that and to have somebody who knows what they're doing with their Zoom. So that's the first thing. Make sure that the meeting is organized and that the technology is properly reserved. Second thing then is going to be to make sure that people attend. Now this should be obvious. And in fact, a lot of what I say today is probably going to seem pretty obvious to you, but a lot of the things that we teach about presentation skills should be obvious, like a presentation should have a conclusion, but most presentations don't. They just finish with, oh, that was my last slide. You have a question? That's not a good conclusion. So a lot of this may seem obvious, but it's good to remind ourselves of some of this. So the attendance is key. The facilitator needs to make sure that people's time is booked. They need to make sure that they are reminded. They also need to make sure that they've got the right participants and that those right participants know that they need to attend. I don't know how many times I've been with a president or vice president of a company, and we've been trying to find some room in their calendar to be working on a presentation or something. And they've been looking at their calendar and thinking, okay, I've got lots of meetings there. Okay, that one I can skip, that one I can miss, that one I might be able to move, etc. If you need these people on your meeting, you need to make sure that they don't do that to you. You need to make sure that they understand this is why they need to participate in this meeting. Their participation is required. And you do need to also make sure that you don't invite people when they are not required, because that fills up their calendar, which causes the kind of problems that these presidents and vice presidents have had, and that many of us have. And by doing that, you're also going to find that when you invite them to another meeting where they actually realize they didn't really need to be there, well, they might not actually prioritize that meeting in the future. So do bear in mind, invite people when they are needed, make it clear they are needed, and don't invite them when they're not needed. Remind people in advance. Make sure it is clear that, as you've seen with the reminder that we sent for this meeting, remind them of when it is, remind them how to get in, just make it easy for people. That's always very important. We take it for granted, but we shouldn't. It's a very important role. Then you move on to the pre-read and the slides. So pre-read, do you need a document for people to read before the meeting? Now, in many business meetings, it actually is very useful for people to have a document that they can read before, where all of the information is. As we've seen in the first of our webinars, where we were talking about the approach that Amazon has, they always make sure that information is given to people in the form of a written document, 6 pages long, and they give them time to read that document in silence so they can properly digest it, because we forget most of what we hear. So we shouldn't be using the slides in a meeting to be giving a lot of information. We should be giving that information before. So is there a pre-read that people need to read before the meeting? Or potentially you give them time at the beginning of the meeting to read a document before you start a discussion? Maybe you don't need a pre-read. Okay, that's fine. Maybe you need some documents that people will have access to during the meeting so that they can make the decisions you're asking them to make. In that case, it's the facilitator's job to either write those documents and distribute them, or to make sure that somebody else does it. And then we move on to the question of slides. Now, you don't always need slides in an online meeting. And remember, one of our revolutions did say, don't pollute a meeting with an unnecessary presentation. If you can avoid a presentation, by all means, avoid a presentation. But what you will find sometimes is that slides can be helpful to direct people's attention and sometimes to attract people's attention in a meeting. Now, I'm using these slides today not really to illustrate what I'm saying very much, because actually what I'm saying, there's not very much that could illustrate it that will make it more impactful or more memorable for you. So I've used this picture of the conductor to remind you that the facilitator is like the orchestra conductor. And you'll see 1 or 2 more images, but it's not like the third webinar, which I did a couple of weeks ago, where there was a new slide every 20 or 30 seconds and where we're really illustrating what I'm talking about. In this case, I'm simply using these slides to direct your attention. And remember, that also makes it easy for people who had to drop off to take a phone call or feed the cat or pick up their child from the floor. They can come back and they realize, oh yes, I just missed the attendance and pre-read, but now I know where we are. And so they don't feel lost. And that's important in an online meeting. So what you don't do, of course, when you're preparing any slides for a meeting, slides like this one, which kind of give a bit of an agenda, what you don't do is to use this kind of slide. So please do bear in mind, this is the kind of thing that we really do not want to see. That, for me, is absolutely a crime against your audience. Because if you're going to be doing that, well, they're always going to be reading and not listening to you. They will read faster than you can speak. They will get to the bottom of the page, and then they will think, okay, right, well, I can do something else while this person is catching up. And then they're not listening to you. So please watch that third webinar if you didn't see it already. It is important to understand how to use slides in an online meeting. So when we get into the meeting, what is the role of the facilitator? Well, there are several roles. So I'm going to cover timekeeping, interaction, objectives, and the conclusion. So to start off with, let's have a look at timekeeping. Now, the timekeeper for today is not me, it's Camille. So if I start going on and talking for too long, Camille will pipe up and tell me about it, or she may send me a private message, or she might actually just open her microphone and say, Phil, shut up and get on with it, which is entirely possible. She's very polite usually, but it's her job. So the facilitator needs to make sure that the meeting finishes on time, or ideally a little bit early. Always try and give people back a little bit of time rather than finishing exactly on time. If you're running a meeting, this one's from 4 until 5 o'clock here in France, well, if you're finishing exactly at 5 o'clock, that means that people will be late for their next meeting. If you finish a couple of minutes early, it gives them a chance to be on time for their next meeting, and you avoid the domino effect. So do try to finish just a bit earlier than planned. But this means that the facilitator needs to keep an eye on the watch, they need to keep an eye on the time and make sure that things are happening. And that means that you sometimes need to stop people. If somebody is talking and talking and talking and talking, and you know that they're used to doing this and talking for a long time, you actually may need to put up a virtual kind of timeout sign and say, okay, all of this is very interesting, honestly, but we have a tight schedule today, so let's move on to the next point, or whatever it might be. And it's important to make sure that 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 the role of the timekeeper is clear at the start of the meeting, because nobody wants the meeting to overrun. So as long as it is clear and someone says, so if you go on for too long, I will be forced to interrupt you. Trust me, I don't want to, but we all want to finish this meeting on time. So I'll do that. Please understand, etc. And then people will be much less unhappy. I won't say they'll be pleased about it, but they'll be less unhappy about being interrupted. Now, it may be that the facilitator is not the timekeeper. It may be that the facilitator delegates somebody else to be the timekeeper, and that's fine. You don't have to do everything yourself all the time, but at least make it clear to everyone who is the timekeeper, that they have that role, and that if you can't go on too long, you should expect to be interrupted so that you can move on and keep the meeting on time. So to keep this meeting on time, I'm going to move on. The second responsibility of the facilitator during an online meeting is to facilitate the interaction. So interaction is very important. Now remember, we have different flavors of online meeting. This one is a webinar. So a webinar is where most of the talking is done by one or two people and everybody else is pretty much on mute listening in. And in that sort of situation, you do need to really focus on the interaction. So that's where Camille is responsible for the chat. There's not much chat going on at the moment, I don't think, but by all means, chat with Camille or ask questions or give a comment or your own experience or something. I can't really do all of that typing, because if I'm typing, then I'm not speaking and I'm not on track here. So it's useful for the facilitator to be the one who is keeping that interaction going. And in a meeting which is more of a smaller meeting, a discussion, collaboration, team type meeting, that is where the facilitator has a slightly different role related to the interaction. This is where everybody has the opportunity to speak and make a contribution. The facilitator needs to make sure everybody has a chance to be heard. Now, we all know that there are some people who are, you could call them a loudmouth. They're the people who tend to dominate. They speak more than they listen. And we tend to hear these people far too much in any meeting, and particularly in online meetings. So one of the key roles of the facilitator is to make sure that everybody has a chance to speak, that everybody is heard, and that those who are perhaps less assertive and don't want to talk when they're not invited to do so, or don't want to interrupt anybody, and they don't want to take the microphone for themselves effectively, it's the facilitator's role to make sure those people have a chance to be heard, to ask them their opinion, to ask what they think, to ask them to make a contribution, and to keep the loudmouths under control. This is a very important role. It's also very important to keep a focus on the meeting objectives. The facilitator knows the meeting objectives. It's important to make sure that everybody else knows the meeting objectives, but the facilitator needs to keep their eyes on the prize. They need to understand that this meeting is intended not to be a talking shop so that everyone feels they've been heard. No, we actually have objectives. We have decisions we need to be making, or we have something we need to create together if it's a collaboration meeting. Whatever it might be, keep your eyes on the objectives at all times and make sure that you're moving towards those objectives. And if you feel that you're not meeting them or that the conversation is going nowhere, well, in that case, time out, remind people of the objectives and try to bring them back onto the subject. And the last piece here then is to give a conclusion to a meeting. So a presentation needs a conclusion, but a meeting needs a conclusion as well. It's not good when it just finishes with, all right, well, we'll have another one next week. So yeah, see you next week or something. The facilitator should bring the meeting to a close, remind people, this is what we have done, this is what we have decided, this is what we have agreed or whatever. And if there are any next steps, if there are any action points, they should list those action points and make sure that people agree with them at the time. So having a proper meeting conclusion and explaining next steps to everybody, it doesn't take long, but it is important that somebody does it. That's a role that a facilitator really should be doing. So when we come to After the meeting, well, unfortunately, the role of the facilitator has not finished once the meeting is over and the Zoom meeting is, or the Teams meeting has been switched off. No, there should still be some more responsibilities. The first one is to make sure that the meeting has minutes and action points. So minutes, for those of you who are not native English speakers, this isn't something about time. Meeting minutes basically means where it's a written account of who was in the meeting, what was discussed, and what was agreed, and what the action points are going to be. So really making sure that the people who were in the meeting have a written trace of this is who was here, this is what we decided, this is what's going to happen next. Now that is really useful. Too often we find that people have used the PowerPoint slides, usually very bad bullet point PowerPoint slides, as a kind of a written trace of what was said during a meeting, but they're not. The PowerPoint slides are a very poor written trace of what somebody thought about before the meeting. They are not a trace of what happened during the meeting, unless it was simply a presentation. So it's very important to make sure that there is documented evidence of who said what was actually done. You don't need a full 12-page document, maybe just a one-pager, or which reminds people of what happened in the meeting and what the action points are going to be. Now, this is doubly helpful. It's useful for the people who were in the meeting, but its biggest use is for people who weren't in the meeting. And this is where some of the magic happens. And it's not a modern technology. It's not a fantastic, wonderful innovation. This is going back to the olden days when people actually did take meeting minutes, but it helps. We're all overloaded with too many meetings. If there are always going to be minutes shared after a meeting, not only with participants, but also with stakeholders, people who just want to stay in the loop, well, that means that those people will not feel the need to participate in unnecessary meetings. Far too often, I remember back when I was working in a big company, I would end up attending meetings simply because I knew that if I wasn't in the meeting, I would not know what was happening. I would be out of the loop. And a director who is out of the loop is unfortunately in a very difficult political position within that company. So you follow meetings, you participate in meetings that you really shouldn't need to be in, just so that you stay aware of what's happening, because there is no written document afterwards. So if you're facilitating a meeting, prepare that one-page written document, send it to people afterwards, make it available for anybody who has a need to know, even if they do not need to be in the meeting. If they're not a decision maker, if they're not a contributor, but they just want to be informed. Share this with them, and then you'll find that the meetings are not polluted with too many unnecessary participants, and everybody's agenda gets much lighter and more available for when you actually do need them. That is a small step, but it's so, so important. Now, once you have these minutes and the action points listed, you can then focus on follow-up. Now, this isn't necessary in all situations. There is no real follow-up after today, although you will notice that tomorrow you do receive an email from Camille, which gives you not only a link to the replay of this video on YouTube, but also it will give you a document. It's an article on our website which summarizes pretty much everything I've said today, but in a short, easy to understand form, so that if you forget what I say, you will at least have those key messages, and you can share them with other people who weren't fortunate enough to be on this webinar today. So that is going to be the kind of the minutes. There aren't really action points, although I'd be very happy if you do decide to take some actions and adopt some of these practices in your next online meetings. And there isn't really so much follow-up afterwards, although we'd be delighted if you were interested in working more with us so that we can help not only you, but other people in your company to help to succeed in their online meetings or their presentations or both. But in many cases, in many meetings, there will be follow-up. If there are action points, somebody should follow up to make sure they are actually followed up, because otherwise they won't be. So often and I've seen this in many, many companies, where you'll have an off-site meeting, a big conference or something, and the same happens online now, where you agree all sorts of great action plans. You look 6 months later, who actually did very much? No, there was a lot of goodwill, but then we got back to normal and nothing actually happened. So where there are actions, there should be follow-up as well. So those are some of the key things that we need to have done. And let me summarize those here. So I'll just remind you, before we have to focus on setting up the meeting, using the technology and using it properly, making sure the right people attend, but the wrong people don't, making sure that if there is any document, any pre-read document that needs to be prepared, that it is prepared and it is shared, and that people have time to read it. And by the way, a little pro tip that I could give there for the pre-read is, if it's really important people read the document before your meeting time, then send them another invitation just for maybe 15 minutes in their calendar before, not just before, but maybe an hour, 2 hours, or a day before, which says reading of this document. Put the document in the calendar entry, and then they'll have it pop up in their calendar. Oh, I'm supposed to spend 15 minutes doing this. And maybe they don't do it first time, but when they get used to seeing that you're going to do this each time you organize a meeting, and it's very helpful to have read that before the meeting, then they'll get used to it and they'll realize how efficient it can be. And of course, preparing those slides, ideally simple slides, which will either direct people's attention or in some cases attract people's attention. During the meeting, keep an eye on the time, make sure that you're helping with the interaction as much as possible and getting the opinions of those who don't assert themselves or push themselves into the conversation, but make sure you get those people's opinions. Really focus on the objectives to ensure that that when you get to the end of the meeting, you actually have achieved those objectives, and give a good conclusion at the end so that everybody knows exactly what's been decided and what's happening next. And then after the meeting, prepare those minutes, prepare a 1 or 2 pager which summarizes who was there, what was said, what was agreed, and the next steps, and then follow up those next steps. And that will ensure that not only was this meeting a good use of everybody's time, it actually delivers something afterwards. And that's very important. Now, that's all I had to say today in terms of the role of the facilitator. I've not spoken about the importance of speaking, but it is important to bear in mind that with all of these responsibilities during the meeting, and particularly with the responsibility of getting everybody else's opinion, it actually does help if the facilitator is not somebody who is trying to convince everybody of their opinion. The best facilitators are those who actually are kind of slightly outside the conversation. They're the people who are able to get everybody's opinion without passing judgment on it and without trying to convince them of something that they believe themselves. So that means if you are the department head or the team manager, sometimes it's better to have somebody else being that facilitator so that they can be almost neutral. And sometimes in a larger meeting, you may find it's better to bring somebody in from completely outside the group who is a professional facilitator and who is going to be able to play this role without necessarily playing an active part in the conversation. What's also clear is if you've got like a webinar like this, one person doing most of the presenting, it's very hard for that person also to be the facilitator. So it's very useful to have somebody else, and I'm very happy that Camille is online with me today and able to take all of your questions. So I'm going to stop there. Do we now have some questions, particularly about the facilitation? And then afterwards, if we have questions on any other aspect of online meetings, now that we're coming to the end of this webinar series, I'll be delighted to answer those questions. So, and also to hear your feedback and your points of view on what, if anything, that's useful you've learned during this or any other webinars. So, do we have any questions coming in?
Well, hi everyone, and we don't have any question now, so my facilitator role will be quite easy. Well, we have one from Ashish. Thanks, Ashish. So, Phil, what should a subordinate do when a key decision maker is late to a meeting and comes on a very tight schedule, like in a rush mode?
I think there's a second part to that question as well.
Yeah, well, do you want to answer that one first, or?
Well, I think it's two parts of one question. So Ashish is saying, should the meeting organizer wait and keep other stakeholders waiting, or state again what was discussed so far in the meeting? It's a very tricky situation in online meetings. Yes, Ashish, it absolutely is. And it's a difficult situation actually in physical meetings as well, where there is a key decision maker who is late. Now, being late can be seen as being disrespectful to those people who are on time. It's not always their fault. And particularly when it comes to online meetings, while we have to juggle different things at home where we have our kids, we have our pets, we have all sorts of different things. We might have some kind of emergencies. We might need to get to the shops, or there might be a queue at the bank, or whatever it might be. We do need to bear in mind it's not always people's fault when they're late at the moment. Clearly, if it's a decision maker and you are a subordinate, then you're not going to be going at them and saying, come on, you were late to this damn meeting. Honestly, do better next time, huh? Because that's what we call a CLM, career limiting move. You don't do that kind of thing. But do you ask everybody else to wait or not? I would say it depends on whether you know what time that late person is due to arrive. So let's imagine we're starting the meeting at 4 o'clock. And the key decision maker isn't there. If you know, because they've sent you a text to say, I'm really sorry, I'm running late, I'll be there at 4:15. Well, then what, in many cases, I would recommend doing is to say to those people who are there in advance, either one, we start without this person who is going to be 15 minutes late. And then when this person arrives, we explain what we've done up until now to use that time productively. That way, everybody's on the same page. Or you can give those people some time back. You can say to them, look, unfortunately, John, whoever it might be, is running 15 minutes late. So if you want, we'll start the meeting in 15 minutes, and I'll give you a little bit of time to have a coffee break or catch up with your emails. And busy people have lots of things they can be doing. What you don't want to be doing is wasting the time waiting for the person. So sitting there thinking, well, okay, well, I'm not sure when this person's coming in, but we'll start, etc. So if somebody is going to be late, always try and understand how late they're going to be so that you can make that decision. And it's never an easy decision, but don't waste people's time, right? Don't waste the time of the people who are there on time. Sam makes a point there as well that others might not be back 15 minutes later. Yes, that is true. People might not then be back. However, if the key decision maker is then back at 4:15 and the other people aren't back on time, well, hopefully that decision maker will then give them 2 or 3 minutes of tolerance so that you can then start maybe at 4:18. Again, worth bearing in mind, if they're not exactly back on time, they're probably not having a smoke break or whatever, or they're probably not playing on their latest computer game or something. They are probably doing something important, and maybe a little call is overrunning. I would be respectful and tolerant to some extent, but I don't know, maybe it's the English part of me. I do think that being on time for meetings it's a question of respect, and it is important to either be on time or apologize and tell people when you are going to be able to make it. So those are some of the key things I would say to that.
Well, Phil, we have a question from Mathieu, and I'm sure you're the best person to answer this one because, well, you will see why. So Mathieu is asking, how do you deal with the cases when you, meaning one person, have to do all the roles like speaker, facilitator, timekeeper, etc.? What are your tips?
Well, I'd love to say lots of coffee. But actually, I wouldn't give that tip, because if you're going to be the speaker, if you're going to be using your voice, then don't have coffee, because it will dry out your throat. And it's really not going to be very good for the quality and the power of your voice. And also, if you're running an online meeting, you really don't want to be feeling like you need to be going to the nearest restroom. So avoiding the coffee is probably a good thing, but yes, it is difficult when you've got all of these hats, all of these different roles to do. All I can say is plan it carefully, run through everything in your mind before the meeting. Make sure you know the technology really well. If you don't know the technology really well, if you're not comfortable with it, if you're not sure exactly what you can do with or without things, or if you're not sure whether you can have the chat on top of your PowerPoint while you're sharing your PowerPoint, then that's going to be a problem. So at the moment, for example, you're seeing my PowerPoint slide. I'm seeing my chat on the right-hand side. So I actually can't see the right-hand side of my screen. Luckily, I know my slides, but I'm able to see the chat on top of it. But I know that you can see it because I know the technology, and it's not going to be a problem. So you need to just make sure preparation is key in this situation, and it's not easy, but if you fail to prepare, then you'll be preparing to fail. So maybe allow yourself one coffee if you need to, but also try not to get yourself into that situation. Certainly when we're selling webinars now, we're very clearly stating, understand this price includes 2 people because we have a trainer and we also have a facilitator, because that is what is going to make things succeed. That's very important. Any other questions right now? Oh, Sam has come up with a point there, actually. For the minutes, you can record the meeting and do it later. Well, that's actually true. It is also possible in most of the tools that you can actually record the meeting. If you have to play it back later, then that can be a little bit more difficult. But in theory, what I like to do when I'm organizing a meeting, which isn't a webinar, but more of a discussion or agreement business type meeting, is I'll prepare a pre-read. I'll prepare a pre-read where all of the information that is necessary is in advance. What happens then is, at the end of the meeting, I can very simply note down, okay, so this is what was decided based on all of this information. So I can take the pre-read, add a few different points to it, and it may only take 5 minutes, and then I can share that as the meeting minutes. Might take 15, might take 20 minutes, but I've already got the basis of it. And that pre-read is then going to be very useful for the people who weren't participating in the meeting, because they only need to be informed rather than involved. So I do find that that is a way which will enable you to try to do many things at the same time. But practice makes perfect. It's not an easy one, Matthew. Do we have some more questions from anybody?
We don't.
Not at the moment. Why don't I move on then and come back to these 5 steps to virtual meeting success. So we've talked about a lot of these things during these webinars. It may be that you've missed one, or that you have a question about something you saw in a previous webinar about speaking or about slides, or you're curious about 1 or 2 of the things that that I'm doing. So by all means, ask me your questions. We've got another 10 minutes available if you need them. If there aren't any questions, then we'll wrap up a little bit early and give you back some time, as we're very happy to do. So please do type in your questions if you have some. And while we're doing that, I'm going to give just a couple of little kind of extra tips. One of them is regarding facilitation. And that is that another role of the facilitator during the meeting is security. So security is not just making sure that people are muted. So today we've set up the settings so that everybody is muted, and we're sorry, you don't have the possibility to unmute yourself because, well, we're recording this and we don't necessarily have your permission to include your voice on the recording. So that's a copyright matter, if you like, or an image rights matter, and a reason for us to keep everybody on mute, but it's also for the sound quality. Now, if you're in a meeting where you've got 5, 10, maybe 15 people, and everybody has the opportunity to speak, the meeting facilitator really should be making sure that they are cutting everybody's microphone when they are not speaking, because a lot of people refuse to do this. I saw something recently which says the like not muting your mic in an online meeting is like the new version of listening to your voicemail on speakerphone in an open plan office. It's really inconsiderate. But people often don't realize it, or they're trying to multitask. So the facilitator needs to keep an eye on that. And if somebody has forgotten to put mute on, they need to do it for them. to make sure that the sound quality is good for everybody else. So that's one thing. But also in terms of security, it's a question of setting up the security settings and monitoring the security settings so that, for example, only the host can share their screen and other people can't, to allow or not people to annotate things on the slides which are being shared. All of that is another important role for the facilitator. So you can actually see this is becoming a pretty specialist kind of role with a lot of responsibility. And the other little pro tip I'll give, and then we'll see whether you have some questions, is you may notice that I have deliberately, in all of these slides that I've been using, I've deliberately not put anything in the top right-hand corner of my slides. And this is because I'm aware that many of you who are watching this and those who are watching live on YouTube will find that my picture of me and my nice orange shirt is going to be inserted over the top of the top right-hand side of the slides. So if I put things there, you won't be able to see them and it won't look very good. So we've intentionally avoided using that part of the screen. So that's just a little tip that is worth bearing in mind if you're preparing slides for online meetings. And I don't think I covered that a couple of weeks ago. Camille, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we have a question from Sam. Do you know, Phil, if there's an option to record a meeting when you're only a participant and not the host or co-host?
Okay, that firstly depends on the technology. And secondly, depends on the settings. So the settings for this webinar, for example, are that the host has the ability to record, but nobody else does. It is possible within Zoom to set it so that anybody is able to record the meeting. If somebody is recording the meeting, then if you look at the participants list, then you will actually see that that person is recording. There is a kind of a little flashing red circle which shows that I'm recording this meeting today, for example. So it is possible to give people that opportunity, but also to restrict it. Again, that's a responsibility of the facilitator. Now, yes, Mathieu is pointing out, I think, and it's a very fair point, that there are tools that will allow you to record anything happening on your screen. If you've got a Mac, then you've got it installed. It's called QuickTime Player. It's the most basic thing possible. You can just do a new screen, video screen capture, and that will do it for you. So yes, you can record what's going on the screen, but that's not going to actually record the audio. So you can get the slides if you want, and nothing stops people from taking a picture of the slides that are being shared. So always assume that people do have an ability to do that, even if they can't actually record the meeting locally using their Zoom or their Teams. And Mathieu is saying there are some softwares which will allow you to to record the audio. Yes, I'm sure there are. I'm sure there are. So maybe you're not doing it directly in Zoom, but maybe somebody is able to do so. Always assume when you're sharing something online that you're not sharing it as if it can never be recorded. And as Pierre pointed out last week, when we're talking about any kind of online meeting, if you're sharing something which is particularly confidential, don't use an online tool to share it. Use something which is within your intranet. Make sure that people have a VPN to get into it so that it is secured in some way. Don't send it over the internet to a public tool, because you never know whether it's properly secure or whether some very smart hacker is able to get into it. So security is important. Sam has asked Mathieu whether he actually does have any software recommendations, and if he does, then I'll be happy to share those, or you can see those in the chat. What I would say is, if you're going to be running a meeting, you may find that it is actually useful to record it and make that recording available to everybody. Camille, do we have some more questions?
Yeah, we have one more question from Ashish, linked with the previous webinar, one of the previous one. So he's saying that online meetings flatten the sound quality and emotions. Is there any tip to convey enthusiasm without being over loud? I like this question.
That's a really good question. That's a really good question. So Michael covered some aspects of this in terms of using the 4 tempos of impact. So by all means, go back to our second webinar if you wish. I'm sure that that'll be helpful. But it is true that it's not so easy to convey your emotions, particularly when you're sitting down. But also even, I mean, I'm standing up here today, but I'm having to make my hands much higher than usual, because if they're in their usual kind of position around about waist height, then you're not going to see my hands. So right now you're not seeing my hands. So it's important, if I really want to make a point, that I'm putting my hands higher than I usually would. One thing that you can do sometimes, if you know people are seeing you, is that you can actually move sometimes closer to the camera. Now, you don't always want to be doing this, but just from time to time, just to lean into that. Sometimes it will get people's attention and just make it clear. And if you're using a particular facial expression at that time, then that will convey your emotions a lot better. Ideally, don't stand too far away. If I'm all the way back here, close to my books back here, then it's hard for you to see what emotions I'm actually feeling and trying to convey. So if you are a lot closer to the camera without being too close, then even in a small thumbnail, you're actually able to convey things using not just the sound of your voice, but also your facial expressions. And Michael certainly covered that, the importance of the facial expressions, in our second webinar. So those are the things that I would recommend. But yes, it is important, without necessarily being loud, but vocal variation can help people to really pay attention a lot more. Do we have some more questions?
We don't. And thank you. Thanks to Mathieu and Miguel to help and answer Sam in this webinar. So, well, I think we don't have any more questions, but if you do have other questions later, I will send you an email tomorrow, so you will have my email address and phone number, so don't hesitate to reach out.
Fantastic. So maybe we can then just finish with a small question to you, for those of you who are online. It'd be lovely to hear from you. What did you get out of this webinar? What have you got out of the others if you participated in them? And are there other things you'd like to see? So a little bit of feedback from you, some comments from you. Be very, very happy to hear them just before we finish. So I'm seeing Miguel Angel. It's 8 years since we met. I hope that everything is good for you in the Canaries. It's good to see you there. And seeing some other people saying thanks, etc. Well, thanks to you for actively participating. It's been a pleasure to share these different webinars with you, and I really hope that we'll get some comments from you. I'd like to finish off by making sure it's clear that all of these webinars have been inspired by our online course, which is called Virtual Meeting Revolution, which is aimed at helping organizations to manage their online meetings in a much better way. So what we've shared in these webinars has been a selection of some of the things that we do in this course. It's not the full course, not by any means. And the full course does involve exercises, it does involve using breakout rooms, etc. And sometimes a little bit of work between the sessions so that people actually can practice planning a meeting. So it's something which we certainly recommend. We're finding a lot of people are very, very interested in this right now. If you have any interest in that course for your company or organization, wherever you are in the world, we'd be delighted to hear from you. So do get in touch with us, and we do that we offer that course in English and in French, and also in Spanish, and also in Italian. So if anybody is interested in that in various languages, then we'll be very, very happy to deliver that. So we deliver training in different languages, and based on the last comment here from Eric, French or English beer, or better Belgian one, definitely Belgian. So we do beer in several countries as well. It's been a real pleasure to hear from all of you. And for those of you saying we'd love to meet you, yes, we'd love to meet you too. Hopefully when the lockdown is over, we will all be able to meet up in Paris or elsewhere. In any case, online or in person, it'll be a pleasure to see you. All of the very best. Have a lovely afternoon, and we'll see you again very soon. Thanks to you. Thanks to Camille. Bye-bye.